Hi guys, good evening. Just a quick video, I hope. Listen, I want to just introduce a topic that has been on my mind for a while, at least a certain aspect of it, and it'll lead into some other things, another project I've been working on for quite some time. You know that I write fiction, but I also have spent most of my adult life writing nonfiction as an academic person. Writing theology and history and stuff like that. And I still keep, those interests are still in place, but of course they transform and change over the years. One of my big projects right now is looking at how religion, no, yeah, how religion shapes our ideas, our idea of, not our idea, but how religious the views of writers are, okay, to put that in a nutshell. And by that I mean their actual writing process itself. If we look back at the beginning, the intersection between religion and writing was right at the get-go. When we talk about hieroglyphs is Greek for sacred writing. Hieros is Greek for holy. So right in the early stages, the link between writing and religion was pretty explicit, and I don't want to talk about that too much right now, but I've noticed that, well, in most of the arts, I think, this can be true in science as well. Yeah, it has been true, but my interest is in how is charting the ideas of various writers over the centuries, from Homer and Plato, way up to our modern age, and even for writers who are atheists, like for instance Keats, as Keats proclaimed himself to be, or whatever, or Shelley, who was a devout atheist. They still had oftentimes, when you look at their ideas of the craft of writing, you encounter religious terminology. And this is especially true, especially blatant in the poets, of course. And that's how when Plato discussed this topic, he talked about the poets primarily. And the poets were religious figures. They were figures who had religious significance. The basic idea was that the poets were inspired. We all tend to think that our favorite artists are especially gifted. Are they gifted from God? Well, it depends if you believe in God or not. Like, for instance, Michelangelo, the great Renaissance artist, was nicknamed Il Divino, famously. It means the divine. So the divine Michelangelo, because there was something special, something extraordinary about him, extraordinary about his genius. And we can see this as well with the kind of hagiography that surrounds even secular figures like Einstein or whomever, and someone like Newton was blatantly extremely religious. I'm going a little bit sidetracked at the moment, but what I want to talk about at the moment is how this whole thing was triggered by me thinking about how the internet has influenced people. So I want to say this in as nice way as I can, but what role has the internet played in the dumb revolution, for lack of a better word? So it's sponsored a dumb revolution, and it's funny how just because people have a lot to say doesn't mean they have a lot of knowledge. And the internet has exaggerated something that I've seen in different times with the different literary revolutions. And I want to talk about three of them, the literary revolutions. Some might, for instance, have said that Christianity was part of a literary revolution, and there's some research gone into this, and I'm not going to discuss it right now. But it's easier to talk about. I'm going to talk about three revolutions. I'm going to talk about three sets of revolutions, and the first one I'm going to look at just very briefly was the Protestant Revolution. Reformation. This is the first set of revolutions that came from the printing press, And the Protestant Reformation, you can call it the Protestant Revolution, came as a result of the invention of the printing press, and it was a scholars' revolution. So it wasn't a revolution of the wealthy. It was a revolution of a small section of the more privileged of society, the scholars. So scholars could suddenly avail themselves to a range and number of texts that were very, very difficult, if not impossible, to come by in an earlier age. So figures in this revolution included people like Luther, who did, in fact, whose ideas and changed the modern world and led to things like the 30 Years' War between Protestant countries and Catholic countries, centered in on Germany. So he's obviously a very blatant example of this. You can also look at figures, sort of more liminal figures between, not as overtly political as overt political consequences, like Erasmus or St. Thomas More, Sir Thomas More, Erasmus the Dutch, and Thomas More the Englishman. And what the printing press developed initially was access to texts that there's it's a lot more than the printing press that went into this, but the printing press certainly sped up the revolution of the scholars' revolution, the Protestant Reformation. So, and it made available all these previously unknown for ancient Greek texts, ancient Hebrew texts, which kind of put the scholars suddenly in the place of bishops. So before, bishops had the authority to interpret the Bible, but all of a sudden, because of the printing press and because of various other things, a network of scholars sort of grew up alongside. And originally the church was all literary people were clergy. That's where we get the term clerical work from, as well as various other terms, because the only people who wrote were clergy. Okay, so, but with the invention of the printing press, there was indirectly a creation of a new sort of non-ecclesiastical hierarchy, in a way, led by people like Luther and Erasmus and so on, St. Thomas More. Some of these guys were priests, some of them were not. Very few of them were bishops. St. Thomas More was just a layman. This new world of scholars who suddenly had a hierarchy and a privileged place of interpreting knowledge. And so the 30 Years' War, these were the first instances of what I'm going to call this literary revolution. Okay. Now the second one was simply the product of a wider spread literacy. I don't think you can trace the French Revolution and the Russian revolutions back to the invention of the printing press, because they followed it by a couple centuries, almost 3 centuries in terms of the French Revolution, and 4 centuries in terms of the Russian Revolution. So even though the invention of the printing press certainly made those revolutions possible, preceded them by so much that we can't just say that they are products of the invention of the printing press, but they were the direct product of a growing literacy. The French Revolution in 1789 was the product of the lower middle class, really. So literate people, examples of people who, like Diderot or Rousseau, who were not from wealthy families. These were sort of your run-of-the-mill lawyers and bureaucrats and so on, lower, insignificant clergymen who wanted a piece of the pie. Now, they were more educated than the kings, the dukes, and the princes that were running things, and these were celebrated figures. I mean, even someone like Voltaire, he amassed wealth, but he didn't come from great wealth. So there was, it never happens that the greater educated long accept their lower position. So the French Revolution was the revolution of lower middle class people who looked with contempt on the ideas of claims to authority based upon lineage alone, like the fact that you were born from a noble family made you better than someone who was more intelligent and learned than you. Okay, so that's the French Revolution, 1789. Much of the same can be said for the Russian Revolution. Now, the Russian Revolution is much more interesting to me than the French one, and I certainly have learned a great deal about it because of my love of Russian literature. The Russian Revolution, I mean, you can track it if you learn, even if you can track it in the lives of the great fiction writers of Russia and people like Dostoevsky. I mean, Dostoevsky was originally going to be executed as a revolutionary, and he was friends in his youth with certain revolutionaries, but he turned away from that. And Tolstoy, for instance, who was a nobleman, he certainly he loved Rousseau, and he certainly had those sort of old ideas, old by his time, of the original sort of French romantic notion of revolution, which didn't correspond in any way to the Russian situation, at least not the Russia of his old age, but perhaps the Russia of his youth, and the romantic heroes of Russia's 1820s and so on. But Tolstoy was no revolutionary in that sense. He became an ardent mystic, Christian mystic, and a pacifist. He hated the Russian government, but he also hated revolutionaries. He knew they were all cut from the same cloth. Other writers, like I'm going to talk about for a few minutes, Gorky, Maxim Gorky, who isn't as well known as some Russian writers, like the Golden Age and Silver Age Russian writers. But Maxim Gorky is his works are wonderful points of entry into the gritty world of turn of the century Russia. So for instance, there's pictures of Gorky with old man Tolstoy, with Chekhov and so on. So, but there's also pictures of him with Stalin. So Gorky's life, I don't know if you would call that the Bronze Age of Russian literature. The Golden Age is the age of Pushkin, and the Silver Age is Tolstoy, Dostoevsky, and Turgenev. I suppose we should say the Bronze Age was that of Gorky and Chekhov, I suppose. So Gorky's works, and his most well-read work, is beautiful. It's sort of a semi-autobiographical work. It's in three parts. The first it's sort of like Tolstoy's three-part, in a way. It's literary biography, autobiography. The first part's called My Childhood, and then the second part is often translated as my apprenticeship or something like that, or my universities. It's obviously there's some liberty being taken with the translations here, and the last one is called something like In the World. So these are amazing examinations of a lower class Russian at around the turn of the century. So the first part of the autobiography was published in 1913, and subsequently 1916 and 1923 for the other volumes. But for instance, if you look at My Universities, the fascinating thing about it is, well, Gorky never went to university, but the way he speaks of it is the books and the people he encountered, especially the people he encountered, but I'd say also the books he encountered. This was his university. His university was the Russian people. And if you think Dickens was in touch with the life of the poor, he looks like a Sunday school teacher compared to Gorky, in a sense. He's not X-rated, but he is very gritty. He gets us very close to that very depressing, poor, suffering life of the poor of Russia, of his time. So you get a real sense for why the Russian Revolution happened. But I mean, we can't talk about or exhaust the topic right now. But in someone like Gorky, I mean, Gorky was a decent human being, and his works are humanistic in a certain sense, that they were interested in portraying the actual lives of people and so on. He wasn't, I mean, although for a while he was friendly with Stalin, I mean, he was a communist. He was an avowed communist, you know, even more so than someone like Solzhenitsyn was. He was a communist, and there's no two ways about it. But I don't think he really knew what Stalin was up to. In fact, I know he didn't really know what Stalin was up to. And one of the rumors is that Gorky was killed by Stalin in the end. Whether he was or not, Gorky was an old man by the time, with tons of the Russian people loved him. The communists loved him. So it wasn't possible for him, you know, Stalin to put him on trial or whatever. So he was a perfect candidate for a surreptitious accident or poisoning or something. Now, Gorky's nephew, I think, was overtly killed by Stalin. So this just goes to show, sort of, you know, Gorky, yes, was a communist, but he wasn't a Stalinist, even though he was on more intimate terms with Stalin than many others were. So now, okay, I call that the second set of literary revolutions, the French and the Russian revolutions. There's a lot of other counterparts for this. You can look at developments in England. You can look at the 19th century history of Germany, for instance, the 1848 uprisings and so on. These were all, in a sense, instances or revolutions of perhaps parts of sets of literary revolutions. Now, the next one is the one I witness every day. Every day I turn on the internet and go online, and it's the revolutions that are being fomented now by the internet. Now, what do I mean? I mean that the information, the partial information, the partial education that's being given via Twitter and Facebook and places like that have led to the creation of things like Black Lives Matter, the increase in popularity of groups like Antifa. Okay, so these are very low information people. Okay, they are, if you ever look at the mugshots of the people and so on, these are very low information people. If you look at the tweets and the statements of people who represent these extreme left-wing positions, these are, I mean, it would be a stretch to call them half-educated. And many of their intellectual leaders are themselves half-educated. So, I mean, in our democratic age and in our Christian age, it's against our nature to want to say things like this, things that don't appear all that humble, and say things like, well, they are half-educated, they don't know what the hell they're talking about. And you can see it, like, even if you take, for instance, the idea of critical race theory and so on. So you know, the people who talk the most about these things, they have very little historical knowledge. They display a great deal of ignorance with respect to world history. They know a certain number of aspects, decontextualized aspects of American history, but these are the people that wouldn't be able to tell you when slavery was abolished or anything like that, wouldn't be able to sort of tell you anything else about the history of slavery, wouldn't be able to tell you anything about, in Canada, for instance, right now we're facing a similar thing right now with regard to there was a mass grave found of children who lived in a residential school, and it's being milked by the media as a finding of huge import. But the thing is, the people who are talking about it, the people who are tweeting about it and Facebooking about it, these are not people who have any historical knowledge. They couldn't tell you what life was like, back when those graves were dug. They have no idea. So a specific unpleasant part of history is being taken and milked politically without any context whatsoever. So this is the kind of thing that the internet is creating. Now, it's no different than the revolution, the revolution that people like Tolstoy and Dostoevsky were living through. They have, beautiful, wonderful books. Like, for instance, Tolstoy's Resurrection talks a lot about different figures who were whatever, socialists or communists or whatever, and Dostoevsky's has several famous characters who are socialists or communists or whatever, and in several of his books, in Crime and Punishment, that's a major theme in Brothers Karamazov, and the best and the most thorough is in his Devils or his Demons, whichever way you want to translate it. And again, there was no difference then than now. It's partial information, right? And one of the most famous and influential books in Russia in the 19th century to this end was Chernyshevsky's What Is to Be Done. And it's a rambling, it's a novel, but it's sort of a rambling, emotivistic piece of literature, which was hugely impacting. And I suppose you could kind of compare it to something like, remember that book a few years ago, The Da Vinci Code? The Da Vinci Code's a great instance of, like, I've studied ancient Christianity as my specialty, and it never ceases to amaze me how people can be manipulated with partial information, and it happens all the time. And even scholars like Elaine Pagels, for instance, sells millions of books because she presents her things as her these ancient Gnostic texts as discoveries and so on. Well, they're not discoveries. They've been known to scholars for centuries. And the Da Vinci Code, became so interesting because it was like there was secret stuff. Well, it's secret because you don't have a degree in history, you don't have a degree in art history, you don't have a degree in history of philosophy or anything like that. That's why it's a mystery, and that's why it's a great surprise and or stunning revelation. Well, it's a revelation to you because you're not thoroughly educated. So the same thing is going on now. And let me put it this way. The greatest example of this is the fact that the doctrines that people are espousing as a part of Black Lives Matter and Antifa and so on, these are the doctrines, the exact doctrines, the Marxist doctrines that got 100 million people killed under Stalin, Mao, in Cambodia, in Vietnam, in Korea, and in other places in the world. Doctrines that are divisive, this is the exact history of the world 100 years ago. There's no change, but the people who are advocating these things are living in complete ignorance about the consequences of Marxist doctrine. It was only 100 years ago. People know a lot, well, they know about the dangers of Nazism, but they don't know the dangers of Stalinism or of Marxism or communism. And that doctrine, the Marxist doctrine, has killed 10 times more people than Nazism has. And so that's just, it's just a blatant example. And the information's out there. The information has been out there for years. Now, the depths of Stalin's depravity wasn't known in the West very well, but even a long time ago, people like the English writer Animal Farm, he had to discover that, whoops, I got these guys wrong. And Wells was an advocate of communism and so on until he discovered what was going on. Sorry, I said Wells, I meant Orwell. Orwell didn't know what was going on, just like for instance, the great philosopher Bertrand Russell didn't know what Stalin was up to, because it's not like Stalin was broadcasting his gulags, his genocide. Okay, so the West was deluded. Okay, but these things are well known now. Stalin's archives have been opened up since 1989, and some real good histories have been written since then about detailing Stalin's atrocities. And these were the things that were opened up to the West through the writings of Solzhenitsyn in my parents' childhoods, in my parents' youth. Okay, so this was big news back in the 70s when Solzhenitsyn was blowing the door wide open. This was all a surprise. I mean, Stalin was Stalin couldn't, had to hide these things because he needed the West's help against Germany and so on. And the West didn't want to hear about another thing they had to deal with after they dealt with Hitler. Okay, but this is not a surprise anymore, but it's the same kind of ignorance that that enabled Stalin 70, 80 years ago to do the things that he did. There's no excuse for it anymore. But the media, the internet, can create as much disinformation as information. It can create as many holes to learning as learning itself. And if there's one thing that remains true, it's that half of the truth is easier to learn and preferable often than the whole truth. If the last 500 years since the invention of the printing press is anything to go by, then the invention of the internet is going to lead to a lot of bad stuff. It's changing the landscape of information as profoundly as did the invention of the printing press and of the invention of cheap print and newspapers in the centuries between the invention of the printing press and the invention of the internet. So it's a history of political movements being driven forward by partial information. And when you change the information landscape, you change the political landscape. And there's always a lot of blood that gets spilled as a result. So thanks for listening, guys.